Three imposters posing as HOA enforcers stormed into the home of 82-year-old Ruth Eleanor Granger, thinking they'd found the perfect mark. They were wrong. These men assumed that because Ruth lived alone on a remote stretch of rural Georgia, because she was old, because she moved slowly and kept to herself, she wouldn't be a threat. They thought she'd fold under pressure. But Ruth wasn't just an old woman with memories. She was the daughter of a World War II infantryman, the widow of a Korean War veteran, and the grandmother of a Marine who never came home from Iraq. She was resilience in a rocking chair, strength in slippers. And she had something else they didn't expect, a 1945 Colt M1911 passed down through generations, polished every other Sunday, and still very much operational. It all began on a suffocatingly hot Thursday afternoon in late August. The cicadas buzzed like electrical wires along the sycamores, and the gravel in Ruth's long dirt driveway baked beneath the sun. She stood in her kitchen, slowly drying her hands on a faded dish towel, when the sound of tires crunching gravel brought her attention to the window. A matte black SUV rolled to a halt just beyond the porch. Its tinted windows masked its occupants, and an unauthorized decal reading HOA Enforcement Division was slapped on the door at an awkward angle, peeling, unofficial, and entirely fictional. Ruth squinted, hard and bothered, but mind sharp. She didn't live in an HOA. Never had. Never would. Her property had been carved out of the pine forest by her late husband, Franklin Granger, in 1956. The house they built with their bare hands stood proud, surrounded by open fields and thick woods. There had been whispers in the area lately, rumors of men dressed in fake tactical gear, showing up in unmarked vehicles, tricking elderly residents into handing over valuables. Some said they posed as tax collectors or city inspectors. Others claimed they were from local associations demanding fines. But they all had one thing in common: they targeted the vulnerable. Ruth Granger was not vulnerable. As the SUV idled, Ruth turned and walked, slow but purposeful, toward the pantry. She reached up and moved aside a tin of molasses cookies and a jar of preserved peaches. Behind them, hidden behind generations of habit, sat a weathered wooden box. The metal latch clicked open with a familiar squeal, and inside, resting on a folded cloth stained with oil and time, was her father's service pistol. It still gleamed with care, its weight familiar and reassuring in her small hands. Her father had brought it home from Normandy, and it had never failed. Not in Europe, not in decades of careful guarding, and not now. Outside, the SUV doors opened in synchronized thuds. Three men stepped out. The first was lean, with wiry muscles and tattoos crawling down his arms. He cracked his knuckles like he expected to be feared. The second was shorter, bulkier, and moved toward the side yard with practiced confidence. The third, clearly in charge, wore mirrored sunglasses and a sneer that reeked of overcompensation. They didn't knock politely. The tall one pounded on the door with a heavy fist. "This is the HOA Enforcement Division," he barked. "We've received multiple violations on your property: excess clutter, ordinance breaches, unpaid dues." Ruth didn't answer right away. She stood just inside the hallway, Colt in hand, breath calm. She knew a threat when she saw one, and these weren't men interested in conversation. "This property is not part of an HOA," she finally called through the door, voice firm, unwavering. "You're trespassing. Leave now." Silence followed for half a beat. Then the leader stepped closer. "Ma'am, you can't refuse inspection. If you don't open this door, we'll be forced to take corrective action." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The tall man kicked the door. It cracked but held. The second man circled the house, now testing the shed's lock. The leader signaled again. Another kick. The latch splintered. Ruth stepped back into the shadowed hallway. Her arms shook slightly, not from fear, but from age and adrenaline. Her father had taught her to shoot. Her husband had shown her how to stay calm. Her grandson had died protecting something bigger than himself. Ruth would not dishonor any of them. As the door gave way, the wiry man stepped into the foyer and froze. He hadn't expected the sight of a grandmother standing firm, pistol in hand. "You won't shoot," he smirked. "You probably can't even see straight." Ruth took one breath and squeezed the trigger. The Colt's report cracked like thunder through the hallway. The intruder's leg buckled. He hit the ground, eyes wide in shock more than pain. His companions froze. Chaos erupted. The shorter one ran. The leader ducked and yelled into a walkie-talkie. But luck wasn't with them. 2 doors down, Vincent Rhodes, retired Air Force and a quiet neighbor, had been watching the entire scene unfold from behind his blinds. He'd noticed the SUV. He'd seen the fake gear. And when he heard the gunshot, he moved. Shotgun in hand, he stepped into the yard just as the intruders began scrambling. "Down," he said flatly. "Now." The words had the weight of combat behind them. The remaining two hit the dirt. Sirens wailed in the distance, already summoned by Vincent's earlier call to the sheriff. By the time deputies arrived, the situation was under control. 3 men in custody, one limping and swearing, the others silent. Ruth was seated calmly inside, the pistol laid respectfully on her kitchen table. Deputies interviewed her, took statements, and within hours the story spread, first through the local news, then statewide. Investigators followed the trail and uncovered something far uglier. A sitting board member of a nearby HOA had been orchestrating a scam. He provided addresses of elderly residents believed to own valuable items, military relics, heirlooms, antique collections, and paid hired hands to pose as enforcement officers. Their job: bluff their way in, scare the homeowner, take what they could, and disappear. It had worked. Until Ruth. The ensuing fallout was swift. The HOA board disavowed the rogue member, but 2 of its officers were later arrested for involvement. Pawn shops were raided. Stolen items recovered. At least 7 elderly residents from surrounding neighborhoods came forward, revealing similar stories they had previously been too ashamed to report. Ruth's defiance had given them voice. The trial was short. Ruth stood before the court, poised, composed. She wore a simple wool coat. Her silver hair pulled back in a bun. She needed no theatrics. When asked why she fired, her answer was clear: because they broke into my home. Because they thought I wouldn't fight back. Because they forgot some of us still remember what it means to defend what matters. The jury didn't deliberate long. Not guilty. Fully acquitted. The judge thanked her for her composure and bravery. The city later offered her a financial settlement, which she declined. Instead, she proposed a safety initiative: free home surveillance systems for seniors, regular wellness checks, and a rapid response hotline. The proposal passed unanimously. Months later, Ruth sat on her porch, tea in hand, watching the sunset. The same Colt now rested behind glass in a display case on her mantel. A small plaque beneath it read, "Family. Freedom. Faith." The weapon wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol. Not of violence, but of vigilance. When a boy from down the street passed by and called out, "Good evening, Mrs. Granger. Everything okay?" Ruth smiled gently, waved, and said, "Everything's just fine now." And it was. Because courage doesn't always come in the form of uniforms or badges. Sometimes it wears soft cardigans, walks with a cane, and holds history in a steady hand. And sometimes, when the world forgets what real strength looks like, it only takes one grandmother to remind it,